The idea of self-actualization has developed a bad reputation lately, at least in the world of film, television, and the analysis and critique of such media. I myself have spoken quite freely about the shallowness and emptiness of self-actualization in Hollywood during the past decade or so. But the problem lies not within the concept itself, but rather how those various stories executed the theme as part of their alleged character arcs. So today, let's break down some examples of how to properly and improperly write protagonists who become self-actualized over the course of their stories. But before I get to the rules on how to properly construct such an arc, let's define what we mean by self-actualization. Psychology nerds like myself will doubtless remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a pyramid that lays out the various things that human beings require in order to be fulfilled. At the very bottom, we find basic physiological needs such as food and shelter. Obviously, if you can't feed yourself and your family, you won't, or at least shouldn't, care about maintaining your self-esteem. At the very top of this pyramid, that is, the thing which we are free to strive for when all other needs have been achieved, is self-actualization. The ability to examine ourselves, discover our fullest potential, and then see it realized within us. The 4 stories that we are going to cover today all feature a protagonist who reaches this apex of personal growth, but how and why they do so will, as it turns out, make all the difference. Whether or not they adhere to the very official and totally not made up rules of writing self-actualization will determine if their stories will resonate with and inspire audiences, or if they will make their viewers groan louder than they did when they watched Scott's Tots for the first time. Rule number 1. Self-actualize for the right reason. If you have been following this channel for a while, you will know that I don't tend to talk about current political issues, but I absolutely do discuss cultural trends. The former is, well, not as easy to avoid as I would like when doing media analysis these days, but the latter is practically unavoidable unless you focus solely on the technical aspects of film or game making. The stories we create and consume both shape and are shaped by our current cultural climate. And the modern Western culture in which I live is highly individualistic and seems to only be getting more so. If I wanted to quickly illustrate this idea, I might point to declining rates in both marriage and births, or to the fact that both extremes of the political spectrum, exemplified in the manosphere on the far right and the 4B movement on the far left, discourage any actual, genuine, selfless relationships. Because relationships are scary, they require you to give of yourself, to make yourself vulnerable, to give the person you love the chance, should they so choose, to really hurt you. But if you check Maslow's hierarchy, you will find love and belonging as the third and middle tier. We need relationships before we can reach the heights of the oh-so-precious self-actualization. Whether those are romantic relationships or just good, honest friendships is up to a given person's situation and calling, but the simple human need for each other is undeniably indispensable. No one is going to reach their apex as a person on their own. It's just not possible. No success of mine can ever be attributed to me and me alone. Countless people have taught us, inspired us, encouraged us, enabling us to make it up that mountain. That undeniable truth then turns around and tells us that reaching one's fullest potential is meaningless and hollow if that potential is not then put to use for the good of those whom we love. If done right, self-actualization will strengthen the foundation of love and belonging on which it is built, allowing further growth as a person. After all, self-actualization is never really done, and thus creating a positive feedback loop that lifts up everyone in our lives. Which finally brings me to our first character who will become self-actualized over the course of his story, namely Emmett Burkowski, the main character of the Lego Movie. I remember being completely taken by surprise by this film. I definitely did not expect it to be much good at all, but man, did it blow my expectations out of the water. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was like Wait, when did the Lego Movie come out? Yeah, you know that scene in The Two Towers where Theoden visibly de-ages? I'm feeling that, but in reverse right now. Anyway, Emmett is a prime example of how to write a self-actualizing character properly, in no small part because he starts on that all-important foundation of relationship. The opening minutes of his story make it unmistakably clear that what Emmett wants above all else is to belong. hence his enthusiastic greeting of everyone and every cat whom he encounters.
Fluffy Senior, Jeff, meow.
Or the only original thought he has ever had being his invention of the double-decker couch, because he has, in his dreams, too many friends to be contained by one sofa. This is good. It gives us something to build on. It establishes the character as someone who is inherently others-centric and selfless. Problem being, Emmett has absolutely nothing to offer those would-be friends.
I know that guy, but I know like zippy zap about him.
I mean, all he does is say yes to everything everybody else is doing.
Wait, I'm so confused. Who are we talking about? Wait, does he work with us?
And Emmett is nothing.
Because as much as we are called to give of ourselves in any given relationship, we have to have something to give first. This is a lesson every mom and dad learns at some point. We want to be great parents who provide for our broods every need and desire, but we are in fact only human and thus have needs of our own. We cannot simply be parents, we have to be people first. That doesn't mean you should ignore your children's needs. Of course, you as a parent have to make sacrifices, often far more than you would like. I'm basically saying you shouldn't ignore your very legitimate needs that can be found on this pyramid, such as maintaining your relationship with your spouse. If you are merely a vehicle through which your child gets his every want fulfilled, it's going to be extremely difficult to form an actual relationship with that kid, because to him, you're not a person like he is. In that same vein, Emmett is so willing and eager to be a friend that he fails to realize he needs to be a person before that can happen. Again, his desire for a relationship is commendable and gives him a solid base, but it has been taken to an extreme, as all otherwise admirable qualities can, and so it becomes the very vice which prevents him from obtaining the thing that he desires above all else. We find this same theme echoed but played out quite differently in the opening scenes of Wreck-It Ralph, as the titular character finds himself increasingly resentful of the role he is coded to play and the ensuing loneliness that he has had to endure over the past 3 decades. Ralph, like Emmett, wants to be accepted by his fellows, wants to belong, to be appreciated and loved. However, the problem he will have to overcome is practically the exact opposite of Emmett's challenge. Where Ralph demands his fellow characters take and accept him as he is,
and I'm a big part of the game, technically speaking,
Emmett's mirroring behavior absolutely screams, take me as you are. They both share the desire for relationship and belonging, but they are approaching it from 2 opposite angles. And it's apparent that Ralph's desire for relationship is less pure and others-centric than Emmett's is. Where Emmett is willing to change literally anything about himself just to fit in, Ralph would have everyone else turn on a dime and change their attitudes toward him, because he too wants to be able to eat cake and party. Should the Nicelander simply accept that Ralph has to play his part during the day and isn't really so bad and thus be willing to include and befriend him? Should Emmett's coworkers see that he's genuinely trying to be friendly and encourage him to cultivate his own interests? Yeah, sure. But these aren't their stories. If everyone changes to accommodate our heroes, even if those changes are done in the name of fairness and kindness, what value is there in that story? What kind of message is that? Just demand everyone else change so you don't have to would be a pretty terrible takeaway from a film. Which leads me to rule number 2. If you are the solution, then you must also be the problem. When asked what is wrong with the world, G.K. Chesterton allegedly replied simply, I am. Whether or not he ever actually wrote that witty, seemingly self-deprecating reply is up for debate, but what is certain is the wisdom of those words. I can blame anyone and everyone I want about whatever unfortunate circumstances I may find myself in, but even if my every accusation is 100% truthful, what can I do about it? Can I change the past? Can I change how people act? Can I even change how others perceive me? No, not really, and not directly. Our influence over how others think and act is generally quite weak, and weaker still if we have an external attribution. We cannot empower ourselves by trying to change others, by yelling at them about how they should accept us, or how their ways are foolish, outdated, or short-sighted. If you want to change the world, you have to change yourself first. This is hardly new wisdom. I did just quote a late 19th, early 20th century author after all, but it remains relevant because, well, we as human beings are generally quite prone to repeating our errors. It's uncomfortable to admit that you are in your own way, and that whatever real external obstacles you may face, they will not just up and move unless you conquer them yourself. So when Hollywood, and by Hollywood I do mostly mean Disney, writes characters who become the answer to all their own problems, but who were never once their own stumbling blocks, I fail to see how that is inspiring or empowering. Let's take 2020 Mulan, also better known as T-Mulan, because it's just a perfect example of how to completely botch a sure thing. The original Mulan was another wonderful lesson on how to properly write a character who becomes self-actualized, in no small part because the main battle she has to fight is how to overcome her own innate shortcomings. It wasn't Mulan's fault that she was slower and weaker than the rest of her fellow trainees, just as much as it's not to my credit that I'm taller and can lift more weight than my wife.
It's not my fault being the biggest and the strongest. I don't even exercise.
But it would be obviously useless for her to moan and complain about life being unfair, and even more so to demand that the army lower its standards to accommodate her. Instead, Mulan adapted. She knew there might be all sorts of factors holding her back, but she also knew that the only thing that she could truly change was herself. And so she did just that. Compare that to T-Mulan, in which the titular character just has superpowers, which she finally and fully unlocks by admitting who she really is.
Your deceit weakens you. It poisons your chi.
In other words, the world is holding you back by demanding that you fit into a role. If she would only accept the fact that the world is stupid and she's already awesome, she will reach her fullest potential. Now, I'm not going to pretend that there's not some good in that. You absolutely should seek truth and fight for what you believe in. If others don't like it, well, you can't change them. But I just do not know how you take a story like the original Mulan and flatten out the character arc like you're rolling out pizza dough. No, not even pizza dough. Pierogi dough. Look it up. Having to accept one's own inherent awesomeness is a far cry from the actual meaningful character work found in stories like the Lego Movie and Wreck-It Ralph, the later of which exemplifies rule number 2 fantastically. At almost every point in his journey, Ralph gets in his own way. Right from the start, we see that his mere size and ensuing clumsiness are severe impediments to the belonging and acceptance that he so badly desires. Obviously, it's not really his physical characteristics that hold Ralph back during most of his journey, but rather his own internal motivation.
If you want a medal, we'd let you live up here in the penthouse.
Our would-be hero takes Gene, who is a bit of a bully despite his minute stature, at his word and proceeds to obtain a medal, lose said medal, and then devote every ounce of his energy to reclaiming the prize that will, he believes, grant him everything his heart desires, which, as his daydream shows, is hardly pure and selfless. This tireless pursuit of a shiny golden circle tells us that Ralph is still seeking to change others. He isn't trying to be or act any different, he simply wants to look different in the eyes of his fellow blocks of code in order to fulfill his own ideas of what happiness is.
Pies, ice sculptures, fireworks.
Which will, of course, as he discovers once he returns to his own game, turn out to be hollow and meaningless. Because of course it is. After all, the characters in the arcade all start out with the first 2 tiers of Maslow's pyramid already satisfying. Or, well, most of them do anyway. We as humans can derive some happiness from temporal goods, at least to the point where we are no longer struggling to survive and are free to thrive in more meaningful ways. But once we have all the stuff we truly need, no extra amount of money, cars, or Fortnite skins will ever move our happiness meter 1 inch, at least not for any significant amount of time. Genuine happiness can only be found by moving up the pyramid, and that means forming loving relationships built on self-giving love. If you want proof of that claim, I would refer you to the longest running study on happiness conducted by Harvard, which found that across sociological and economic classes, the best predictor of lasting happiness is authentic relationship with other people. This is something that Ralph doesn't quite understand yet, but Emmett, as we discussed, did from the very start. But he got in his own way by trying to get out of everyone else's. His coworkers and neighbors looked at him and saw him doing his best impression of a mirror and found him entirely uninteresting. I can absolutely relate. That guy who stares back at me while I'm brushing my teeth every morning is just the absolute worst. That dum-dum is constantly getting in my path of success by failing to get enough sleep because he tried to reclaim some sense of freedom by staying up late watching YouTube videos that he's already seen. He is 100% the villain in my story. I suppose you could rephrase self-actualization rule number 2 to say, if your character is the hero, he must also be the villain. Stories like Team Mulan fail because they make self-actualization a man versus man conflict, or a man versus society conflict, where it is inherently meant to be a battle of man versus self. Obviously, it is possible and quite often necessary to include more than just one type of conflict within a story. Wreck-It Ralph does have an external villain in King Candy / Turbo, who shaped his game, his world, according to his every wish and design, much as Ralph would have liked to. But since Ralph is the hero of the story, since he encounters Vanellope and discovers that he does in fact have a heart, that he cares about the fate of someone other than himself, our protagonist does not ultimately fall victim to that same self-serving mindset. Oh, he starts out in that place, and it takes him a while to leave it, which leads me to rule number 3. Self-actualization must be a process. This is such an obvious statement that it almost seems silly to include it, but if you have watched the horrifically disappointing Obi-Wan Kenobi Disney Plus show, then you might know what I'm talking about. Obi-Wan's character journey, if you can call it that, in his own show, is to return to his former status as a courageous and effective Jedi Master who is willing to continue the fight even though it seems hopeless. We'll talk about the issues inherent in that premise in rule number 4, but for the purposes of this rule, the main issue happens a little over halfway through the show, as Obi-Wan and Tala are approaching the Inquisitor's fortress where Leia is being held captive. A series of scenes that has a whole host of logical problems, but I already made that video like 2 whole years ago. Anyway, I'll just show you the problem.
You care about Leia. Then you're gonna have to try.
That's it. That's his character development. That's how he becomes self-actualized. This random woman he has just met tells him to try to get his Jedi powers back for the sake of Leia, so he does. He just does. Don't ask me how. He did it, it's done now, move on. Look at the pretty lights. You love pretty lights. Again, there is something good here. Obi-Wan Kenobi should and does care about the little girl who he rescued, whose father he trained and loved like a brother. And the message, try, can be a powerful one. It is an exhortation to hope even when all seems dark, to fight even when the struggle seems pointless. But it's just so rushed here. It just happens. That's it. He's good. He's a Jedi again. We can get back to kicking Imperial ass. Where is the growth? Where is the struggle that viewers can understand and relate to? Where is the fight? If you were going to go with this recycled premise of old sad man learns to hope again, the least you could do was execute it well. Alas, Obi-Wan Kenobi is no Logan, and the speed at which Obi-Wan goes from completely incompetent to indistinguishable from his Episode 3 self would put Vanellope von Schweetz to shame. Ralph's growing affection for that little vagrant, of course, is ultimately what brings about his self-actualization, but it takes time. At first, he is completely unwilling to help the brat who stole his medal. Then, seeing no other way forward, he reluctantly agrees to help her out, in part because he finds out that she shares his plight as the black sheep of her respective console. Mere sympathy, however, is not a replacement for genuine selfless love.
Just keep telling yourself, I must win Ralph's medal or his life will be ruined.
If Ralph truly cared for Vanellope as he ought to, perhaps he wouldn't be so inclined to believe King Candy's story about why the glitch cannot be allowed to race. It was a convenient truth, one that allowed him to get what he wanted without having to do any more soul-searching or really any more work at all. A truth that leads to the most heart-wrenching scene in the entire game.
I made it for you, just in case we don't win.
What I'm saying is you can't be a racer.
What? No, please, Ralph!
I mean, yikes. We had been watching Ralph and Vanellope gradually grow their bond into one of mutual trust and affection, one seemingly becoming genuine philia, and then in the space of a few minutes, it all shatters. The road to self-actualization, the climb to reach the apex of our potential, is never one without detours and setbacks, most often caused by the character's own flaws and failings. This is doubtless true in real life, as we tend to be our own worst enemies. We are necessarily going to delay and impede our own progress. This is how stories should reflect our own world. This is how you do representation. Not by showing us characters who happen to look like us or share some other surface level attributes, but rather those whose virtues, vices, struggles, triumphs, and yes, failures might just remind us of our own. How many times have I chosen some insignificant good that I momentarily desired over the real and meaningful good of another person? More times than I can count, I'm sure, though I've never been very good at the whole numbers thing. I might watch Wreck-It Ralph and yell, "How could you be so blind?" at the big fella, but then it should only take me a moment of self-reflection to realize that I have been Ralph, albeit in a less dramatic fashion, on an innumerable number of occasions.
I was just tired of living alone in the garbage.
Well, now you can live alone in the penthouse.
Ralph thought he had obtained everything he ever wanted, only to find his reward quite literally hollow and empty. His one shining moment turned out to be his lowest, darkest point. And as you might expect, we find a similar setback in the Lego Movie, a film which I have talked about decidedly too little thus far, despite its protagonist's character arc being the origin of this video idea. Emmett has been slowly built up over the course of the first half of the movie. It wasn't exactly a smooth ride, though. He swung from lonely and disappointed to suddenly elated at the prospect of being the special, back to hapless and inadequate, and then finally his ability to innovate and thus to build began to show itself. That all leads to this scene, where he finds himself placed in the middle of the assembled master builders and is asked to take on the task of leading their would-be rebellion. And it goes less well than he might have hoped.
He is the least qualified person in the world to lead us. And you are right.
Well, you were right about him being a ding-dong.
Just when it seemed Emmett might have a chance to live up to the exceedingly high expectations that the others had piled upon him, he crashes and burns. This is the all-important major setback that basically all stories about self-actualization will contain. It forces our hero to answer the question, who am I when I'm not who I thought I was, who I thought I could be? Do I give up on my dreams? Do I find a new one? Do I return to my old dissatisfying life? The answer will depend, based on the story, of course, though I doubt any narrative worth its salt would have the protagonist simply give up and go home. The story's setback isn't required to be as dramatic as Emmett causing an entire Lego realm to go up in flames. But without such a backslide, the growth of the main character will appear too easy, the struggle less real, and thus the story less inspiring and edifying. Why do bad things happen to good people? So they can become better people. And if we do not become better, we will one day cease to be good. Which brings me to the fourth and final rule for writing self-actualization. Rule number 4. Show growth. End better than you began. As with rule number 3, that sounds so obvious as to be completely and totally unnecessary. I mean, duh. Of course, someone reaching their fullest potential is going to grow throughout the course of their story, right? Well, here's where the Obi-Wan Kenobi show comes into play yet again. See, at the outset of this particular tale, Obi-Wan is starting out in a despondent, lonely, and bitter state.
The fight is done. We lost.
He does grow, albeit clumsily, as the show unfolds though, so what's the problem? The issue here lies not so much in what this story does tell us, but rather in what it does not. When episode 3 ended, Obi-Wan had undoubtedly suffered a major setback. Okay, good, great. But in that same movie, he, being a Jedi Master, resolved to continue doing whatever he could to protect those who could not protect themselves. To keep a flicker of hope alive, even as the Republic and the galaxy fell into darkness. Cut to the man's own show, and somehow that spark has been completely snuffed out. How? Why? The answer to that latter question is apparently because the writers couldn't be bothered to do anything other than to copy and paste sequel trilogy Luke Skywalker's arc onto this pale imitation of Obi-Wan Kenobi. As a result, the man at the end of these 6 episodes is by no stretch of the imagination any braver, wiser, or smarter than he was at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Because his arc, as far as this miniseries is concerned, should have started there, not when the Disney Plus logo rolled onto the screen. And Obi-Wan absolutely could have become more self-actualized than he already was. Just imagine his show was about him choosing to hunt down an Imperial raiding force, only to find out that it was led by Commander Cody, and having to deal with the conflicting desires to keep fighting the good fight and saving the man who served him so loyally and so well during the Clone Wars. But nah, that kind of nuance would take too much time to write, or maybe Disney thought that the dumb Star Wars fans couldn't follow such a complicated interior journey. So they went back to Old Reliable, which everyone just adored in the sequels. Anyway, Yes, that rule sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times it gets violated. Did Mulan really become a better person by the end of her story? Did she? Well, let's ask her dad.
One warrior knows another. You were always there, yet I see you for the first time.
In other words, nope, she was always awesome, everyone else just needed to realize it. Now, in the interest of fairness, Mulan does suffer a setback when she is expelled from her regiment. It's just not a setback of her own making, really, so that takes away from potential character growth. And she at least uses her ridiculously OP abilities for the sake of her country and its people. And in the end, she does refuse the place of honor among the Emperor's guards in order to rejoin her family, which is good and admirable. Let it never be said that I can't extract something edifying out of even the lamest of stories. And that's exactly what Mulan is, really. Lame. Where its predecessor ran, it barely manages to shuffle along. It gave its titular character so little room to grow by setting her up as it did, and the entire story suffered for that fact. Those two narratives, which we are mercifully done examining, failed the same rule in drastically different ways. One, because it refused to actually develop the character in the same manner as the story it was retelling, and the other because it asked us to believe in a setback that we never witnessed, and that made absolutely no sense, instead of actually continuing the character's internal journey. But like I said, we're moving on now, finally approaching the apexes of Ralph's and Emmett's journeys, the moments when they become self-actualized and reach their fullest potential. For Mr. Bukowski, that starts with the realization that in the midst of all these incredibly innovative and unique master builders, he is the one who stands out, purely because he is used to following instructions. His journey to the top actually begins immediately after his major setback, when everyone else around him effortlessly dives into the task of building an escape sub, and Emmett is lost and useless without someone to guide his steps.
Anyone know what this is, and do you need it?
I had to include that joke, I just had to. That's the one moment in the theater that I remember clear as day for this movie. I must have had 50 of those little joints lying around, and I don't think I ever used a single one of them. It goes to show that the scriptwriters were extremely familiar with their subject matter, which I deeply appreciate. Anyway, one of Emmett's best moments comes immediately after that scene, as Unikitty bemoans the fall of her home.
Gosh, I'm so sorry, Unikitty.
The Master Builders are all incredibly talented in their own unique ways, which, as a later scene lays out more explicitly, leads to a heightened sense of individualism. Emmett serves as a counterweight to the rest of them. As he has, since the beginning, been so others-centered, he is more naturally inclined to comfort and encourage others. Emmett, unlike our other hero, never had to shake off any natural selfish inclinations, but rather had to figure out what he could give to others that no one else could. As much as the story of this movie revolves around him, Emmett's worldview is still very much centered on those whom he loves. When Wildstyle tells him what it means to be the special, we see Emmett's face light up at the prospect of being the smartest, most talented person in the whole universe. But why? Well, I'll let him tell you.
It made me want to do everything I could to be the guy you were talking about.
I am blessed with an incredibly loving wife who thinks the world of me, and if I were half the man she sees me as, well, I'd have to go on Etsy and buy one of those world's best husband mugs. I don't understand why they make so many of those. Anyway, this is why Emmett's self-actualization is truly heroic. He strives to reach his fullest potential for the sake of others, and he does so despite Vitruvius's revelation that the whole prophecy business is made up, with a little help from the totally serious Ghost Vitruvius, who tells him to listen to the cat poster and believe that he is capable of great things despite not being the chosen one.
But how can I just decide to believe that I'm special when I'm not?
Because the world depends on it.
Not because Emmett deserves to be appreciated, not because everyone else needs to stop holding him back and recognize his awesomeness, but because everyone else is relying on him. The Lego Movie achieves its protagonist's self-actualization because it began with a solid foundation. It showed us that this was a good man who never fell victim to the me-first mindset that plagues our modern world, but who had to stop holding up a mirror to others and expecting them to like him, who had to discover what gifts he had been given that would allow him to love his friends to the best of his abilities. It's all remarkably corny. I mean, Emmett defeats Lord Business by convincing him that he doesn't need to be the bad guy, that he is the special, that everyone is the special, but it's still so freaking good because it speaks to that universal truth that each and every person on this earth is unique, inimitable, and unrepeatable, that every single one of us matters in ways we can hardly understand. And accompanying that truth is yet another fundamental one. We need and are made for one another. While Emmett always understood that fact to some degree, realizing the value of others, of a single person, is the challenge that Ralph has to overcome in order to fulfill his own potential. After all, it's hard to value someone else when no one has ever valued you. And granted, no one really ever thought much of Emmett, but he thought they did, so he didn't show the same resentment and selfishness that Ralph does. All Ralph ever wanted, at least as far as our story is concerned, was to be respected, to be shown kindness, to enjoy some well-earned comforts after a day of hard work. And all those desires are perfectly fine in their own right, but they are not simply milestones we can reach if we do certain things and check certain boxes. They are instead the fruits of relationships we have built on the foundation of self-giving love. When we left him, Ralph had been given his medal and returned to his own console, only to find it abandoned. It turns out, when we disregard our duties in pursuit of our own impulsive goals, things tend to go south. And if Ralph were a truly miserable man who would rather see others suffer with him than let them be happy while he is not, he would have simply let his game get unplugged out of spite. And perhaps he would have done just that if he hadn't gone on this journey, if he hadn't met Vanellope and come to care for her, albeit in a flawed way, a way that he now seeks to perfect. Ralph very well could return to Sugar Rush, bust Felix out of jail, and at least get his life back as it was, but he has a nobler goal in mind. He has discovered that love does exist and resolves to act out of genuine self-disinterest for the first time in his life.
Please, Felix, fix it, and I promise I will never try to be good again.
What Ralph means, of course, is that he's going to stop trying to be a hero and has resolved to be someone's hero. In other words, he now understands that heroism does not mean cake, fireworks, and ice sculptures, but rather bravery, humility, and self-sacrifice. When the story reaches its climax, the cybugs overrunning Sugar Rush and everyone evacuating, Ralph has a very simple choice to make: himself or Vanellope. All the other characters have fled to safety, but the little glitch is stuck inside her own game, doomed to be eaten by the virus. But Ralph won't have it. He abandoned her once. Never again.
I will never be good, and that's not bad.
This is how you write self-acceptance. Ralph says those words as he dives headfirst into a mountain of Mentos, anticipating the sweet release of death as they combine with the cola hot springs underneath, willingly giving his own life to save that of another. No greater heroism exists, and yet Ralph values himself worth nothing aside from what he can give to others. There is no one he'd rather be than him, because the life he has lived has led him to this moment, has allowed him to finally find within himself the capacity for genuine love. A love that is, as self-sacrificial love ought to be, returned with equal measure. Ralph mercifully doesn't die, especially as this is a kid's movie, but instead is saved by Vanellope risking her own skin, a decision which eventually leads to her reinstatement as a racer, Ralph's return to his villainous role, albeit with a little more charity shown toward him by his fellow characters, and a delightfully happy ending.
If that little kid likes me, how bad can I be?
Why do we strive to reach our fullest potential? So we can love and serve others, including those who have lovingly and selflessly helped us and shown us the way. Who stands in the way of our self-actualization? Ourselves. At the very least, we are the only problems that we always have the power to solve. Is this process a quick and easy one? No, of course not. No road worth traveling, metaphorically speaking, is ever a smooth downhill ride with clear lines of sight. Detours, setbacks, and even dead ends that require us to turn around and try a new route are inevitable and numerous. But what can we do about it? We can grow. We can acknowledge that we can't change what's done, but we can and must move on, because the people we love are counting on us to do just that. Hello there. Thank you for making it to the end of the video, and a very special thank you to all my generous patrons over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel and get bonus behind-the-scenes content, access to our Discord, and the ability to vote on video and stream ideas, please consider becoming a patron. For higher tiers, I'm offering new monthly Discord calls and my services as a critic of your own writing or video making. If you'd like to stay on YouTube, channel memberships have all the same benefits. Regardless, I am still super grateful that you are here as we continue to talk about the stories that really matter. Let me know your thoughts in the comments about Wreck-It Ralph, the Lego Movie, or any other suggestions you might have for a story you love that you'd like to see featured on this channel. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next one.